The document in my stepdad's hands wasn't just a forgery. It was my mother's signature, perfectly replicated, signing away everything she'd left me before she died. But what Thorne didn't know is that I had been 3 steps ahead of him for months. Every lie, every manipulation, every cruel calculation was being recorded in 4K resolution. And I wasn't just planning to expose him. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire existence, piece by agonizing piece. Hit that subscribe button because today's letter to Rae is about patience, planning, psychological warfare, and the most intricately orchestrated takedown you'll ever hear. This isn't just revenge, this is art. Let's dive into Iris's masterpiece of destruction. What I'm about to confess will probably shock you. Not because of what my stepdad did, though that was horrific, but because of the calculated precision with which I destroyed him. I spent 8 months planning his downfall, and when I was finished, he didn't just lose everything. He lost his freedom, his reputation, his sanity, and his will to fight back. Some might say I went too far. But after you hear what he put me through, you'll understand why mercy was never an option. It started 6 months after my mom died from pancreatic cancer, a brutal, drawn-out battle that lasted 2 years and drained our family emotionally and financially. I was 22, a senior at Northwestern studying forensic accounting, which I'd chosen partly because Mom had been a CPA and partly because I'd always been fascinated by how numbers could tell stories that people tried to hide. My biological father had vanished when I was 3, leaving behind nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a restraining order my mother had been forced to file. Thorne Blackwood entered our lives when I was 15, tall, charming, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of smile that made waitresses blush. He worked in consulting, which I later learned was code for unemployed with expensive tastes. For 7 years, I genuinely believed he loved us. He attended my high school graduation, helped me move into my dorm, even walked me to my car when I came home late from dates. He called me kiddo and ruffled my hair, and when Mom got sick, he held her hand through every chemo session. But people show you who they really are when there's money involved. Mom had been extraordinarily careful with her finances. She'd inherited the Victorian house from her grandparents, a stunning 3-story home in Evanston worth over $600,000, and had built a successful accounting firm that she'd sold 2 years before her diagnosis for $800,000. Add to that her life insurance, retirement accounts, and investments, and we're talking about an estate worth nearly $1.4 million. She'd been meticulous about her estate planning. Everything, and I mean everything, was left to me, with one exception. Thorne would receive $3,000 monthly from a trust fund for the rest of his life. It was generous, considering he'd never contributed a dime to our household expenses and had actually borrowed $15,000 from Mom 3 years earlier that he'd never repaid. But apparently, $36,000 a year wasn't enough for a man with expensive habits and hidden debts. The first sign something was wrong came during the will reading. Mr. Davidson, our family lawyer, had known Mom since college and treated the occasion with appropriate solemnity. But as he read the terms of the will, I watched Thorne's face transform. It started with confusion, then moved through disbelief, anger, and finally settled on something that made my skin crawl. Cold, calculating rage. His jaw worked silently, and I could see him mentally tallying numbers, running scenarios, planning something. "Excuse me," Thorne interrupted, his voice carefully controlled. "There must be some mistake. Linda, and I discussed this many times. She was concerned about Iris being so young, having so much responsibility. She wanted me to manage the estate until Iris was at least 30. Mr. Davidson looked over his reading glasses with the patience of someone who dealt with disappointed beneficiaries for 40 years. "Mr. Blackwood, I drafted this will personally." Mrs. Blackwood was very specific about her intentions. She wanted to ensure Iris had complete financial independence. But she was on so much medication toward the end, Thorne pressed. The morphine, the anti-anxiety drugs. She wasn't thinking clearly. The blood rushed to my face. "How dare you? I'm not saying anything bad about Linda," Thorne said quickly, reaching over to pat my hand. "I loved your mother more than my own life. I'm just concerned about you, sweetheart." This is a lot of money for someone who's never had to manage anything more complicated than a college budget. Mr. Davidson's expression had turned decidedly frosty. Mrs. Blackwood was mentally competent when she signed this will. I insisted on a full neuropsychological evaluation before we proceeded, given the size of the estate. She scored in the 95th percentile for cognitive function. Thorne's smile faltered for just a moment, but I caught it. And in that moment, I saw something that would haunt me for months: the cold, predatory calculation of someone who'd already moved beyond grief into pure self-interest. The next few weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolence visits, and the overwhelming task of settling Mom's affairs. Thorne was helpful, supportive even, but I started noticing things. The way he'd hover when I was on the phone with banks or insurance companies. How he'd casually ask about account numbers and passwords. The fact that he'd started receiving mail at our house that he'd quickly snatch up before I could see it. But the real wake-up call came on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the funeral. I was in my room, supposedly studying, but actually crying into my textbook about derivatives and portfolio management, a subject that felt cruelly ironic given my new financial circumstances, when I heard Thorne on the phone downstairs. His voice was different. Harder. More desperate. "I need more time," he was saying. "I know what I owe, but the situation has changed. My wife died, and there are complications with the estate." I crept to the top of the stairs, heart pounding. "No, listen to me, Vincent. The money is there. It's just tied up in legal bullshit. Give me 2 months, and I'll have everything, plus the VIG." Vincent. I'd heard that name before, years ago, when Thorne thought I was asleep. Late-night phone calls that had made Mom pace the kitchen floor, her face tight with worry. "How much?" "Jesus Christ, Vincent, that's okay." "Okay, fine. But I need time to figure this out. The girl inherited everything, and she's not exactly sophisticated about these things. I just need to convince her to see reason." The girl. He was talking about me like I was an obstacle to be managed. "Trust me," Thorne continued, and his voice had taken on a quality I'd never heard before: smooth, manipulative, utterly without conscience. "By Christmas, this will all be resolved, one way or another." I crawled back to my room on hands and knees, mind reeling. Thorne owed money to someone named Vincent, someone who charged VIG, which even my sheltered 22-year-old brain knew meant loan shark interest. And he was planning to convince me to give him access to my inheritance. That night, I made the decision that would change both our lives forever. I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to be a predator. The next morning, I drove to a high-end electronics store in Chicago and spent $2,400 on surveillance equipment. Not the cheap nanny cams you'd find online, but professional-grade wireless cameras with night vision, motion detection, and cloud storage backup. I also bought audio recording devices, a GPS tracker, and something called a digital forensics kit that promised to recover deleted files from computers and phones. I told the sales clerk I was working on a documentary about home security. He was so helpful. Installing the cameras took me 3 days. I waited until Thorne left for his mysterious consulting appointments and systematically wired our house. Kitchen, living room, his bedroom, Mom's old home office, the basement, even the garage. 14 cameras in total, all feeding to a server I hid in the crawl space behind my bedroom closet. But cameras were just the beginning. See, my forensic accounting courses had taught me about digital forensics, and I'd always been good with computers. So while Thorne was out, I cloned his laptop hard drive, installed keylogging software on his computer, and placed a GPS tracker in his car. I even managed to download his call logs from his phone when he left it charging overnight. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Thorne owed $127,000 to Vincent Cardelli, a bookie with connections to some very unpleasant people. The debt had started small, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, but had mushroomed over 2 years as Thorne chased his losses with bigger and bigger bets. The VIG was 3% per week, compounding, which meant he was paying nearly $4,000 weekly just in interest. But the gambling was just the beginning. His call logs revealed a network of creditors, loan sharks, and what appeared to be black market dealers in forged documents. His internet history was a roadmap of desperation, searches for how to contest a will, proving mental incompetence, forging legal documents, and most chillingly, inheritance murder cases dismissed. I sat in my room, staring at my laptop screen, realizing that the man who'd tucked me in when I was 15, who'd driven me to the hospital when I broke my wrist junior year, who'd cried at my mother's funeral, was seriously considering murdering me for my inheritance. That's when I decided that simply exposing him wouldn't be enough. I was going to systematically destroy every aspect of his life, and I was going to make him complicit in his own downfall. Phase 1 of my plan was psychological warfare. I started small. I'd move his keys to different locations, change the coffee brand without mentioning it, adjust the thermostat by 2 degrees. Little things that would make him feel slightly off balance without being obvious. I wanted him stressed, paranoid, making mistakes. Then I escalated. I created fake email accounts and started sending him promotional materials for debt counseling services, gambling addiction programs, and legal aid societies. I made sure they arrived when he was home, so I could watch his reaction through the cameras. His face would go white, then red, then he'd frantically delete the emails and look around suspiciously. I also started planting seeds of doubt about the will. During casual conversations, I'd mention how strange it was that Mom had left everything to me, how maybe she really had intended for him to manage things. I played the confused, overwhelmed daughter perfectly, all while watching him through the cameras as he practically salivated at the possibility that I might voluntarily hand over my inheritance. But the real masterstroke was when I started leaving evidence of my own supposed incompetence. I'd leave fake credit card bills lying around showing huge purchases, create fake emails about failing grades, even had a friend call the house pretending to be a debt collector looking for me. I wanted Thorne to believe that I was financially irresponsible and in over my head. It worked perfectly. Within a month, his demeanor had shifted from sullen resentment to predatory concern. He started offering to help with my finances, suggesting that maybe I should give him power of attorney, just temporarily, until I got my life together. "Iris, sweetheart," he said one evening as I sat at the kitchen table with fake bills scattered around me, "I've been watching you struggle, and I think your mom would want me to step in." I looked up with carefully crafted desperation. "I don't know what to do, Thorne. Everything is so complicated." "That's what I'm here for," he said, sitting down beside me. Through the hidden camera, I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was mentally counting my supposed debts. "What if I took over managing your accounts? Just until you finish school and get established. Would you really do that for me?" "Of course. We're family." Family. The word felt like acid in my mouth, but I managed to look grateful instead of nauseated. That's when phase 2 began, giving him enough rope to hang himself. I started reluctantly, agreeing to his suggestions. I gave him access to one of my smaller bank accounts, one I'd specifically set up with $15,000 for this purpose. I watched through the cameras as he accessed the account online, his fingers literally trembling with excitement as he saw the balance. Within a week, he'd transferred $8,000 to cover part of his gambling debts. He thought he was being clever, taking just enough to buy himself time without raising immediate suspicions. But I had bigger plans. Through my keylogging software, I discovered that Thorne had been researching document forgers online. He'd found someone, a disbarred lawyer named Gregory Ashworth, who specialized in estate planning irregularities. Their email exchanges were fascinating. Ashworth could create a backdated will that would make Thorne the primary beneficiary, complete with fake witnesses and notarization, for $25,000. So I made sure Thorne had access to exactly that amount. I created a fake financial emergency, a story about needing money for legal fees to settle Mom's estate, and asked Thorne to help me liquidate one of my investment accounts. The account actually contained $30,000, and I made a big show of how grateful I was that he was handling these complicated financial matters for me. 3 days later, my cameras caught him meeting with Ashworth in our living room. Gregory Ashworth was exactly what you'd expect from a disbarred lawyer running document forgery schemes: expensive suit, cheap cologne, and the moral flexibility of a carnival barker. He spread the forged documents across our coffee table like he was dealing cards, explaining how the new will would stand up to legal scrutiny. The key, Ashworth was saying, is the narrative. Linda Blackwood reconsidered her decision in her final weeks. She realized that Iris was too young, too immature to handle such a large inheritance. She wanted her husband to manage the estate until Iris proved herself capable. Thorne nodded eagerly. That's exactly what she told me. She was worried about Iris's spending habits, her grades, her general lack of responsibility. I watched from my bedroom, recording every word, as they planned my financial destruction. The witnesses are clean, Ashworth continued. Margaret Hallstein and David Reeves. They're both professional witness services, people who'll swear they witnessed the will signing for $5,000 each. Their testimony will be unshakable. The look on Kieran's face when I told him about Caspian's death was something I'll never forget. It was beyond betrayal, beyond hurt. It was the complete shattering of everything he thought he knew about me, about us, about our life together. He didn't say a word. He just got up from the table and walked out of the house. He didn't come back that night. Or the next. Zelda kept asking where he was, and I made up excuses about work trips and family emergencies. But she was too smart, too observant. She could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. When Kieran finally returned, he had papers with him. Divorce papers. I can't do this anymore, Isla, he said. I can't look at Zelda without seeing your lie. I can't look at you without wondering what else you've been hiding. What about Zelda? I asked, my voice breaking. Are you going to tell her? She's 15 years old. She has a right to know the truth about where she came from. He sat down heavily, looking exhausted. But her biological father is dead, which means I'm the only father she's ever known. I won't abandon her because of your choices. The conversation with Zelda was the hardest thing I've ever done. We sat her down on a Sunday evening, both of us trying to hold it together for her sake. Kieran let me tell her, which was more grace than I deserved. Sweetheart, there's something we need to tell you about your biological father. I began, and I watched her face change from curiosity to confusion to something approaching fear. She took it better than I expected and worse than I hoped. She didn't scream or cry or run to her room. She just sat there, processing, asking practical questions about genetics and medical history. So that's why I'm good at art, she said finally. It wasn't some random talent. But later that night, I heard her crying through her bedroom door. Not the dramatic tears of a teenager, but the quiet, devastating sobs of someone whose entire identity had just shifted beneath them. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Kieran kept his word about Zelda. He maintained a relationship with her, still called himself her father, still showed up for school events and birthdays. But something fundamental had changed between them. She was more careful with him now, less spontaneous with her affection. What I didn't expect was Zelda's reaction to me. She became distant, analytical, studying me like I was a specimen under a microscope. How long were you going to keep lying? She asked me one evening as I made dinner. If the DNA test hadn't happened, would you have taken this secret to your grave? I couldn't answer, because we both knew the truth. Yes, I would have. The worst part came 3 months after the divorce was final. Zelda had been researching Caspian online, piecing together information about her biological father. She came home from school one day with a strange look on her face. Mom, she said, dropping her backpack by the door. I found some interesting information about Caspian Rodriguez. My blood ran cold. What kind of information? She pulled out her phone and showed me a social media post from Caspian's sister. It was a memorial post from the anniversary of his death, and it mentioned something I thought I'd never have to face. Caspian had been married. He had a wife and 2 other children, Zelda's half-siblings. Children who were alive and living just 2 states away. His sister posted about a family reunion last month, Zelda said, her voice eerily calm. She mentioned how much they missed Caspian and how they wished his unknown daughter could have been there to meet the family. I stared at the phone screen, my legs going weak. How did she know about you? Zelda's smile was cold, so much like Caspian's when he was making a point. because I reached out to them 6 weeks ago. I told them who I was and sent them pictures. The family resemblance was pretty obvious. Zelda, you can't just. They want to meet me, she continued. Caspin's wife, my stepmother, says I'm welcome anytime. My half-brother and half-sister are excited to have another sibling. They're planning a visit next month. I sank into a chair, realizing that my 15-year-old daughter had just rewritten our entire family dynamic without consulting me. She'd taken control of her own narrative in a way that was both impressive and terrifying. There's one more thing, Zelda said, sitting down across from me. Caspin's wife told me something interesting. She said Caspin came home from a business conference once years ago and seemed different.
Distracted.
He mentioned meeting someone special, someone he connected with in a way he hadn't expected. My heart stopped. She always wondered if something happened that night. If maybe he'd met someone who made him question everything. Zelda's dark eyes, Caspin's eyes, stared into mine. She says she forgave him years ago for whatever it was, but she always wondered if there were consequences. The room felt like it was spinning. Not only had I destroyed my own family with my lies, but I'd potentially damaged Caspin's marriage too. Even from the grave, the consequences of that one night kept rippling outward. They don't blame you, Zelda said quietly. Caspin's family. They're actually grateful. They said knowing about me helps them understand the melancholy Caspian carried in his last years. Apparently, he'd become withdrawn, almost like he was carrying some kind of secret. I realized then that Caspin had been living with the same guilt I'd carried. Maybe he'd suspected Zelda might be his daughter. Maybe he'd spent years wondering, questioning, carrying the weight of that possibility. Zelda stood up and headed toward the stairs, then paused. I'm going to visit them next weekend. Dad, Kieran, is driving me there. He says it's important for me to know all sides of my heritage. Zelda, wait. I called after her, but she was already halfway up the stairs. By the way, Mom, she said without turning around. Caspin's sister says I have his eyes, his stubborn streak, and his inability to let sleeping dogs lie. She disappeared into her room, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the wreckage of my choices spread out before me like broken glass. Now Zelda splits her time between our house, Kieran's apartment, and weekend visits with Caspian's family. She's found her place in the world, built connections with people who share her blood, her talents, her temperament. She's thriving in a way that both breaks my heart and fills me with pride. But I'm alone now with the truth I tried so hard to bury. Kieran has started dating someone new, a woman who doesn't carry the weight of 15 years of lies. Zelda treats me politely but distantly, like I'm a stranger who happens to live in her house. The final twist came last week when Zelda announced she'd been accepted to an early admission program for college. She's planning to major in genetics with a focus on family counseling. I want to help other people navigate complicated family situations, she told me with a pointed look. I think I have some unique insights into how secrets can shape a family. I realized then that my daughter, Caspin's daughter, was going to spend her life helping other people deal with the exact kind of mess I'd created. Rae, the truth didn't set me free like everyone says it will. It just traded one prison for another. But at least now the bars are made of honesty instead of lies. I even insisted on paying his legal fees, since he was doing so much to help me. Meanwhile, I was putting the final touches on his destruction. I'd already compiled evidence packages for the FBI, the State Attorney General, the IRS, and local police. I'd prepared detailed reports for the Illinois Bar Association about Gregory Ashworth's document forgery operation. I'd even contacted the insurance companies that Thorne had defrauded in other schemes. But the most devastating package was the one I prepared for Rebecca Manning. I included photos of Thorne at gambling establishments, recordings of him discussing his plans to steal my inheritance, copies of the forged will, and a detailed timeline showing how he'd been planning to fund their relationship with money stolen from his dead wife's daughter. I also included screenshots of text messages between Thorne and other women, because of course there wasn't just one affair. Rebecca was simply the most recent in a long line of women he'd been using for money, connections, or simple entertainment. The court date for probate was set for December 15th, Thorne had hired an expensive lawyer using money stolen from my accounts, and he was confident, almost giddy, as we prepared for what he thought would be a routine approval of his forged will. "Don't worry, Iris," he kept saying as we sat in the courthouse waiting room. "This is just a formality. Soon you'll be free to focus on your studies while I handle all these boring financial details." "I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should," I replied, and I meant every word. When our case was called, Thorne's lawyer, a skilled estate attorney named Hamilton Ross who had no idea he was presenting fraudulent documents, made a compelling presentation. Poor Iris's mother had wisely reconsidered her initial will, recognizing that her daughter needed guidance and protection during her transition to adulthood. The tragic fire had nearly destroyed this important document, but fortunately it had been preserved in a safety deposit box. Judge Patricia Hendricks listened politely, asked a few routine questions, and seemed prepared to approve the probate when I stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to contest this will." The courtroom went completely silent. Thorne's face cycled through confusion, shock, and what looked like genuine fear. "On what grounds?" Hamilton Ross asked, clearly caught off guard. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "On the grounds that it's a forgery, Your Honor. And I have extensive video and audio evidence of Mr. Blackwood creating fraudulent documents, committing arson, and conspiring with others to defraud me of my rightful inheritance." Thorne shot to his feet. "That's insane." "Iris, what are you talking about? I've been trying to help you." "Mr. Blackwood, sit down," Judge Hendricks said sharply. "Ms. Blackwood, do you have legal representation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Patricia Chun, the inheritance fraud specialist I'd hired, stepped forward. "We'd like to present evidence that Mr. Blackwood has committed multiple felonies in an attempt to defraud my client of her inheritance, including document forgery, arson, theft, and conspiracy." What followed was 2.5 hours of the most devastating evidence presentation I've ever witnessed. Video after video played on the courtroom screen. Thorne practicing Mom's signature until he could replicate it perfectly. Phone calls where he discussed his gambling debts and his plans to steal my inheritance. The meeting with Gregory Ashworth where they planned the forgery scheme. Recordings of him mocking my intelligence and bragging about how easy it was to manipulate me. But the most damaging evidence was financial. I traced every dollar he'd stolen, every bet he'd placed, every payment to forgers and fake witnesses. The paper trail was meticulous and undeniable. As each piece of evidence was presented, I watched Thorne disintegrate. His expensive suit seemed to hang loose on his shrinking frame. His face went from confident to confused to terrified to resigned. By the time they played the recording of him laughing about how my mother had been too trusting, he wasn't even bothering to maintain his innocence. Hamilton Ross tried valiantly to mount a defense, but there was nothing he could do. His client had been caught red-handed committing multiple felonies, and the evidence was overwhelming. The most devastating moment came when Judge Hendricks asked me directly, "Ms. Blackwood, how long have you been aware of these criminal activities?" "Since 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, Your Honor," I replied calmly. "I installed surveillance cameras in our home when I became suspicious of Mr. Blackwood's behavior. Everything you've seen today was recorded over a period of 8 months. 8 months. The judge looked incredulous. "You've been recording these activities for 8 months, and you're just now bringing this to the court's attention?" "Yes, Your Honor. I wanted to ensure I had comprehensive evidence of the full scope of Mr. Blackwood's criminal activities. I also wanted to give him every opportunity to reconsider his actions and do the right thing." Judge Hendricks stared at me for a long moment. "That's remarkably thorough, Ms. Blackwood." "My mother raised me to be thorough, Your Honor, and patient." The judge turned to Thorne, who was slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. "Mr. Blackwood, this court has rarely seen such clear and convincing evidence of inheritance fraud. The forged will is obviously invalid, and I'm ordering the immediate restoration of all assets to Ms. Blackwood. I'm also referring this case to the FBI, the State Attorney General, and local prosecutors for criminal charges." But I wasn't finished. "Your Honor," I said, standing again. I'd like to request that Mr. Blackwood be held in contempt for presenting fraudulent documents to this court and that he be immediately arrested on charges of theft, as he's currently in possession of over $35,000 that he stole from my accounts." Judge Hendricks nodded grimly. "Granted. Bailiff, please arrest Mr. Blackwood on charges of theft, fraud, and contempt of court." As the bailiff approached, Thorne finally found his voice. "Iris, please," he said, his voice cracking. "I was desperate. I owed money to dangerous people. I never meant for things to go this far." I looked at him, this man who'd sat at our dinner table for 7 years, who'd held my mother's hand as she died, who'd tried to steal everything she'd worked for and blame it on her mental incompetence, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "You were right about one thing, Thorne," I said as the bailiff cuffed his hands behind his back. "I am my mother's daughter, and my mother taught me that actions have consequences." But his arrest was just the beginning of his destruction. Within 48 hours of Thorne's arrest, his entire world collapsed in spectacular fashion. The FBI raided Gregory Ashworth's office and discovered evidence of dozens of document forgery schemes. Ashworth immediately flipped on his clients, providing detailed testimony about Thorne's fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. The fake witnesses, Margaret Hallstein and David Reeves, were arrested at their respective homes. When faced with federal conspiracy charges, they both gave full confessions and agreed to testify against Thorne. Rebecca Manning received her evidence package by certified mail the morning after Thorne's arrest. According to a mutual acquaintance, she spent 3 hours vomiting after reading through the documents, then immediately went to her boss to confess that she'd been unknowingly involved with a man who was planning to use stolen money to buy her expensive gifts. She lost her job, her reputation, and had to move back in with her parents in Indiana. The other women Thorne had been involved with, and there were 5 of them, all received similar packages. 2 of them contacted police with additional evidence of his financial crimes. One of them, a widow named Patricia, whom he'd been scamming for months, had actually lent him $12,000 that he'd never repaid. Vincent Cardelli, the loan shark who'd been pressing Thorne for payment, was arrested as part of a larger FBI investigation into organized crime gambling operations. Apparently, my evidence packages had provided law enforcement with exactly the information they needed to connect several ongoing investigations. Thorne's extended family, his brother in Arizona, his elderly parents in Florida, his ex-wife from his first marriage, all received packages detailing his crimes. His brother, a respected physician, publicly disowned him. His parents changed their will to exclude him entirely. His ex-wife, who'd been receiving alimony payments, sued him for fraud when she learned the money had been stolen from his current stepdaughter. The IRS conducted a full audit of Thorne's finances going back 7 years and discovered that he'd been evading taxes on his gambling winnings and fraudulent income. They seized his car, his personal belongings, and placed liens on any future assets he might acquire. But the most satisfying part was watching him in court. Thorne's trial began 8 months after his arrest. By then, he'd aged what looked like 10 years. His hair had gone completely gray, he'd lost significant weight, and he had the defeated posture of a man who knew he was facing decades in prison. His public defender tried to mount a defense based on gambling addiction and desperation, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Video recordings of him laughing about manipulating me, audio of him calling my mother stupid for trusting him, financial records showing systematic theft over nearly a year. There was no way to paint him as anything other than a calculating predator. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, painted a devastating picture of a man who'd infiltrated a family during their most vulnerable time, exploited their grief and trust, and systematically stolen from a daughter while dishonoring her dead mother's memory. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Santos said during her closing argument, "this case isn't just about money. It's about the most fundamental betrayal imaginable. Thorne Blackwood didn't just steal from Iris Blackwood. He stole her sense of security, her trust in family, her faith that the people who claim to love us won't exploit our grief for their own gain. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: inheritance fraud, document forgery, theft, arson, conspiracy, tax evasion, and racketeering. Judge Hendricks, who'd also presided over the probate hearing, looked directly at Thorne during sentencing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "in 32 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a defendant who showed such callous disregard for both the law and basic human decency. You exploited the grief of a young woman who trusted you, dishonored the memory of your deceased wife, and showed no remorse until you were caught red-handed." The sentence: 18 years in federal prison, full restitution of all stolen funds plus penalties and interest, forfeiture of all assets, and lifetime prohibition from serving as executor, trustee, or beneficiary of any estate. But even that wasn't the end. Gregory Ashworth received 12 years and was permanently disbarred. The fake witnesses got 5 years each. Vincent Cardelli and his gambling operation were dismantled entirely. Rebecca Manning was charged as an accessory after the fact for her role in planning to spend money she knew came from questionable sources. The ripple effects continued for years. The case became a landmark precedent for inheritance fraud prosecution. Law schools used it as a teaching example of comprehensive evidence gathering. The Illinois Bar Association changed their rules about estate document verification because of weaknesses exposed during the investigation. Rae, I know what you're thinking. Did I go too far? Was 8 months of systematic psychological manipulation and character assassination excessive revenge for attempted inheritance fraud? Maybe. But here's what I learned during those long months of planning Thorne's destruction. He wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my mother's legacy, her memory, her final wishes for my future. He was willing to burn down my childhood home, destroy irreplaceable family documents, and paint my mother as mentally incompetent, all to cover up his own gambling addiction and criminal greed. When I think about the alternative, if I'd simply confronted him that first night when I overheard his phone call, he would have denied everything, destroyed the evidence, and probably succeeded in his plan. I would have been left with nothing but suspicions and a forged will that might have held up in court. Instead, I gave him enough rope to hang himself, and he eagerly grabbed every inch of it. I didn't force him to forge documents, steal money, or conspire with criminals. I simply created the conditions where his true nature could fully reveal itself, and then I documented every choice he made. The most satisfying part wasn't watching him get arrested or seeing him sentenced to 18 years in prison. It was the moment in that courtroom when he finally understood that the naive college girl he'd been manipulating for months had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. The moment he realized that every cruel laugh, every mocking comment, every casual dismissal of my intelligence had been recorded and would be used to destroy him completely. My mother used to tell me that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. The people who underestimate you, she'd say, are giving you the greatest gift possible. They're telling you exactly how to defeat them. Thorne underestimated me because I was young, because I was grieving, because I was a woman. He saw vulnerability where he should have seen strength, naivety where he should have seen calculation, trust where he should have seen a trap being set. And in the end, that arrogance cost him everything. I still live in Mom's house. I finished my forensic accounting degree, summa cum laude by the way, and now I work for a firm that specializes in white-collar crime investigation. Turns out I have a talent for catching people who think they're smarter than everyone else. Sometimes I get letters from Thorne in prison. I never open them. Whatever he has to say now is 18 years too late. But I did frame one thing from his trial, a photo from the local newspaper showing him in handcuffs, head down, being led away after sentencing. The headline reads, "Local man sentenced for elaborate inheritance fraud." I keep it on my desk as a reminder that justice isn't always swift, but it can be thorough. So that's my confession, dear viewers. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a moment of explosive confrontation. It's months of careful planning, meticulous evidence gathering, and the patience to let your enemy destroy themselves while you document every step. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to Letters to Rae for more confessions that prove karma is real. It just sometimes needs a little help from someone with a forensic accounting degree and access to high-end surveillance equipment. Tell me in the comments, what's the most elaborate revenge you've ever witnessed? And remember, some stories are too personal to share with just anyone. That's why they write to Rae. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next episode, where we'll explore another letter about justice, consequences, and the sweet taste of perfectly orchestrated payback.